It wasn't about politics that night. It was about something deeper: character, dignity, and service. When Barack Obama stood up to speak, he didn't just answer Trump. He reminded America what true leadership looks like. The room was packed, every seat filled, every eye forward. Reporters, scholars, and ordinary citizens all gathered under one roof to witness a rare event. Two presidents, past and present, sharing the same stage. The stage lights glowed softly, throwing long shadows across the floor. The banners behind them read, "Leadership in the Future of America." The title sounded harmless, polite even, but the air carried something different. It felt charged, as if everyone knew this wasn't going to be a calm conversation. At one end of the stage stood Donald Trump, the current president, straight-backed, wearing that familiar confident expression. His tie was perfect, his posture commanding. He glanced across the stage, taking in the sight of his predecessor. Sitting a few feet away was Barack Obama, calm, composed, hands folded, watching quietly. Their presence together was rare. Too rare. The audience sensed it, the sharp contrast between Trump's bold energy and Obama's patient stillness. It was the kind of moment that made people lean forward, unsure of what might happen next. Trump had been invited to open the discussion. It was supposed to be a conversation about leadership, how presidents shape the nation and what values guide them. But as Trump adjusted the microphone and looked toward Obama, it was clear he intended to do more than just talk. He wanted to prove something. The first few sentences came smooth and practiced. He talked about America's strength, about rebuilding the economy, about standing tall before the world. The crowd nodded, polite applause followed. But then slowly his tone began to shift. His words became heavier, sharper. He said, "Leadership isn't just about speeches and promises. It's about building something that lasts, something you can hand down." The room quieted. He smiled slightly and added, "That's what I've done all my life. I build things that last. I don't just talk about change. I make it real." Somewhere in the front row, someone whispered. But most of the crowd stayed silent, hanging on every word. Trump continued, pacing his sentences like a man who knew the weight of a spotlight. "The greatest leaders," he said, "understand loyalty. They understand family. You don't just lead for today, you lead for tomorrow. You lead so your children can continue what you've started." That was when people began exchanging glances. They knew exactly what he was suggesting, that leadership, like business, could be a legacy. That the Trump name, the Trump family, was more than a brand. It was a future, Trump went on, his voice steady but filled with pride. "Strong families make strong nations," he said. "It's about tradition, about keeping power in the hands of those who know how to use it. That's how a country stays great." He paused, then looked straight toward Obama. It wasn't a glare. It was more like a challenge. And then he said it. The line that turned polite attention into uneasy silence. "Some people talked about change, but I made it happen. I turned words into walls, promises into results. That's real leadership." A few claps echoed through the hall, but most people didn't move. They could feel it. The temperature of the room had changed. The tone was no longer about ideas. It was personal now. Obama still hadn't moved. He sat still, expression unreadable, eyes fixed on Trump as if waiting. Trump went on for another minute, building his case. He talked about vision, family, and success. He spoke as if leadership was an inheritance, something to be protected and handed down like a crown or a company. And then he wrapped his opening with a final, almost boastful line. "Real leaders don't fade away. They build legacies their children can carry. That's how nations stay strong." The audience didn't know how to react. Some clapped out of habit. Others just looked at each other, unsure. The energy had shifted again, heavier, slower. Trump turned, confident, expecting some form of agreement or maybe even respect. But when he looked at Obama, he didn't see a nod. He saw calm, absolute calm. Obama slowly unfolded his hands, his gaze steady but soft, as if weighing the right moment. The faintest hint of a smile appeared, not of mockery but of understanding. The silence between them stretched for a few seconds longer than anyone expected, and in that silence the air seemed to thicken, like the pause before a storm. Everyone in the room knew something was about to happen. Trump had made his point, loud, proud, and certain. He believed he'd won that moment. that his version of leadership had been laid out for the world to hear. But Obama was about to speak. And no one, not even Trump, was ready for what he was going to say next. The applause faded, leaving behind an expectant hush. The microphone stood before President Trump like a challenge waiting to be met. He straightened his tie, glanced briefly toward Obama, and began to speak. His voice carried the same sharp confidence that had always defined him. Each word came out measured, but full of force. "You know," he started, pausing just long enough to make sure every ear was listening, "people talk about leadership like it's some mystery. But it's not. Leadership is simple. It's about strength. It's about results. And it's about family." The last word, family, hung in the air a little longer than the others. He repeated it again as if to make sure it landed where he wanted it to. Family, that's what keeps a country strong. Somewhere in the audience, pens stopped moving. People leaned forward. Everyone could feel it. This wasn't just a speech about leadership. This was about legacy. Trump's tone deepened. "When I think of America, I think of generations. I think of fathers teaching their sons to work hard, to protect what's theirs, and to keep the name strong. That's what I've done. That's what we're doing right now." He paused, letting his eyes travel across the audience before resting briefly on Obama again. "You can't build a strong nation without strong families. That's how you keep a country moving forward, generation after generation." He shifted slightly, the faintest trace of pride in his smile. "I built my business with that in mind. I built it to last. Not for one moment, not for one election, but for decades. That's leadership. That's vision." The crowd listened, caught between fascination and unease. Trump spoke with certainty, but there was an undertone, something larger than the words themselves. He wasn't just describing leadership. He was describing ownership. "See," he said, "real leaders don't come and go. They create something solid, something permanent. They teach their families to carry it on, to protect it. That's how you make greatness last." A few heads nodded in the audience. Trump noticed and leaned into that energy. "When people talk about me, they talk about success. They talk about a name that means something. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens because you work, you fight, and you make sure the next generation knows exactly what to do." He paused again. The silence made every word feel heavier. That's what America needs, leaders who think beyond their term, beyond themselves. Leaders who think about the next chapter and who's going to write it. It was a clever way to frame the idea. He wasn't saying it directly, but his meaning was clear. The Trump family wasn't just part of his story. It was the story. The name, the image, the brand, it all tied together. And then with the faintest smile, he added, "Some people talk about change. They make promises. They talk about hope. But talk doesn't build anything. Words don't last. I build things that last." The reference was obvious. The audience shifted, sensing that he had aimed that remark at the man sitting across from him. Still, Trump kept going, his tone firm but even. "Leadership is about more than speeches. It's about what you leave behind. It's about strength, not softness. Tradition, not constant change. That's how nations survive." He spread his hands slightly as if revealing a truth everyone else had missed. "You protect your own. You make sure the people who come after you are ready. That's what real leadership is. You don't just serve for a few years. You build something your family, your team, your people can continue." There it was again, that word, family. Each time he said it, it sounded less like affection and more like authority. He turned his gaze once more to Obama, this time holding it for a beat longer. "You talked about hope," Trump said, "but hope doesn't pay bills. Hope doesn't build buildings. Hope doesn't protect borders. Leadership does. Results do. And when you build right, when you lead strong, your family carries that work forward." The crowd stayed still. Then he finished, voice steady but proud. "That's the kind of leadership America deserves. Leadership that lasts. Leadership that stays." A few claps broke out near the back of the room. Others followed, though the applause was cautious, unsure. It was the kind of reaction that came not from excitement, but from the weight of what had just been said. Trump gave a small nod, satisfied. To him it was a statement of truth. He had drawn a line, a vision of power that stretched beyond politics into bloodline. He stepped back from the microphone for a moment, looking across the stage. Obama hadn't moved, not even a shift in his posture. His hand still rested calmly, his eyes steady, unreadable. For a second, Trump's confidence flickered. Just for a second. Because in Obama's silence, there was something unspoken, a quiet strength that didn't need volume to be seen. The crowd, too, seemed to sense it. Something was coming. Something different. Trump had spoken of power, of wealth, of legacy. He had built his case brick by brick with certainty and pride, but the story wasn't finished. The man sitting across from him was about to answer, and not with anger or boastfulness, but with something far more disarming, something that would remind everyone in that room that legacies can fade, but lessons last forever. For a moment, no one moved. Trump's final words still hung in the air, heavy and proud, like the echo of a gavel. The applause had faded into scattered claps, and even those stopped quickly. Then came a silence so complete that it felt almost deliberate, as if the room itself was waiting for something to happen. Barack Obama slowly rose from his chair. He didn't rush. He didn't reach for notes. He didn't need to. He simply stood, tall and calm, the kind of calm that comes not from quietness but from certainty. When he began to speak, his tone was low but clear, a voice that carried not by force, but by weight. "Mr. President," he said, "I appreciate your words about tradition and family. But let me tell you something important. Leadership in this country has never been a family business." The sentence cut through the room like a spark. A few people turned to look at each other, unsure whether to react. Trump's chin lifted slightly, his expression tightening. Obama continued, his voice steady, not harsh but deliberate. "America was not built on inheritance," he said. "It was built on ideals, on the belief that anyone from anywhere could rise through hard work and service." He looked out across the audience. "Our founding fathers didn't fight to protect their family names. They fought so no one family could own this country." The audience leaned in. There was no anger in his tone, no shouting, just the slow, careful rhythm of a man who wanted to remind everyone of something they had forgotten. "When I first took office," Obama said, "I met people who worked double shifts just to pay their rent. People who didn't come from famous families or old money, but who still believed they could change their lives. And they did, because that's what America promises. That's what it has always promised." He paused, his eyes briefly meeting Trump's. "That's the beauty of our democracy. It doesn't pass through bloodlines. It passes through trust." The words lingered, quiet but powerful. Then Obama began to weave his history lesson, not as a list of facts, but as a story of people who had built the nation with their courage and their hands. "Think about Abraham Lincoln," he said, "a man born in a log cabin who taught himself to read by firelight. He didn't inherit wealth. He inherited struggle, and he used it to unite a divided country." The audience was completely still now. You could almost feel the shift, the room moving from tension to reflection. "Franklin Roosevelt," Obama went on, "led a nation through fear and loss. He couldn't walk, but he carried millions on his shoulders. That's not legacy, and that's service." He stepped forward slightly, his tone deepening. "John F. Kennedy once asked Americans to think not about what they could take, but what they could give. And generations of leaders since have tried to live by that question, not to make their family names stronger, but to make the nation stronger." Then he looked directly at Trump again. His voice softened, but it became even more intense. "You said leadership is about what you pass down, and I agree, but not in the way you mean it. What we pass down shouldn't be our names or our wealth. It should be our example." The audience breathed in as one. Obama's tone was calm, almost reflective. "A president's job isn't to make sure his family thrives," he said quietly. "It's to make sure every family has a chance. That's the difference between building a dynasty and building a democracy." Trump stayed silent, eyes fixed on the stage, but his usual confidence seemed to soften. For once, he wasn't the loudest voice in the room. Obama continued, his words slower now, almost like a teacher finishing a lesson. "Leadership is not about who holds power. It's about how you use it. It's not about how much you own. It's about how much good you do." He smiled faintly, not at Trump, but at the audience. "Every generation has people who believe power can be kept in one family, one circle, one set of hands. But history always proves them wrong. Because America doesn't belong to a name, it belongs to its people." The last few words hit harder than anything he had said before. There was no anger in them, no arrogance, and only truth. He ended with a single line that felt final, almost like the closing of a book. If our founders had wanted kings, he said, they wouldn't have built a country of equals. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent. People weren't just listening, and they were thinking. Trump didn't move. The man known for quick comebacks and strong words had none this time. Obama stepped back slightly, letting the silence do the rest. He had taken Trump's lecture about legacy and turned it into a reflection on the meaning of leadership itself. And in that quiet, the crowd understood something that didn't need to be said aloud, that real power doesn't come from owning the moment, but from shaping what comes after it. Obama's lesson wasn't just about history, it was about the future. And as he returned to his seat, the air felt different, lighter yet heavier with understanding. Everyone knew the conversation wasn't over. But in that instant it was clear. The stage no longer belonged to the loudest voice. It belonged to the one that made people listen. For a moment the world seemed to pause. The air inside the hall felt heavy, filled with the quiet hum of thoughts no one dared to speak. Obama had just finished his words and they hung there, calm, sharp, and unforgettable. Trump sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. His usual confidence, the kind that filled rooms before he even spoke, seemed to have dimmed. His jaw tightened slightly, and his fingers tapped against the table, a small, restless rhythm that betrayed more than he wanted anyone to notice. The audience remained silent. Cameras pointed, eyes watched, breaths held. Everyone was waiting for something, a response, a retort, maybe a clever comeback. But none came. It was strange to see. Trump had always been the man who had a word for everything, a counter for every statement, a way to twist any situation back into his favor. But this time, the weight of Obama's words seemed to press down like a quiet truth no sound could escape. Obama didn't gloat. He didn't smile or show any sign of victory. He simply sat, composed, his hands folded in front of him. It wasn't triumph he carried, it was conviction. Trump cleared his throat once, as if preparing to speak. The microphone caught the small sound, amplifying it through the speakers. A few people shifted in their seats, but instead of words, there was only a long exhale, the kind that fills the space between pride and realization. In that silence, something powerful was happening. The audience could feel the shift, not just in the conversation, but in the atmosphere itself. It wasn't just about two presidents anymore. It was about two worlds colliding, one built on name and inheritance and the other on service and history. Obama's words had drawn an invisible line. On one side stood power defined by possession, on the other power defined by purpose. And in that moment, the line was clearer than ever. Trump's eyes flickered toward the audience. He could feel them, the quiet stares, the thoughtful faces. Some still admired him, no doubt. But admiration felt different now. It wasn't blind and it wasn't loud. It was cautious, curious, waiting. He finally spoke, but his voice wasn't as sharp as before. "Well," he began softly, "you certainly have a way with words." There was a faint ripple of laughter from somewhere in the back, nervous and unsure. Obama gave a small nod, acknowledging the comment, but said nothing in return. Trump leaned back in his chair. For once, he wasn't leading the room. The air belonged to someone else. The moderator, sensing the tension, hesitated before speaking. "Would either of you like to add?" But she didn't finish. The weight of the silence answered for them. Obama's earlier words seemed to echo again. If our founders had wanted kings, they wouldn't have built a country of equals. It was as if that single line had frozen time. People in the crowd weren't clapping, weren't shouting. They were thinking, quietly, deeply. That was the real victory. Obama hadn't needed to win an argument. He had changed the room's rhythm. He had replaced noise with thought. Trump's face softened slightly, though his pride fought to hold its ground. There was something unfamiliar in his eyes, not defeat but reflection. He was a man used to commanding loyalty and applause, not silence. Yet here he was, facing both at once, and the silence wasn't cruel. It wasn't mocking. It was the kind of silence that follows truth, the kind that reminds people that no matter how powerful a voice may be, it can always be humbled by reason. Obama finally looked toward Trump and spoke once more, gently, not as a rival, but as someone sharing a truth. Power is temporary, he said, but what we do with it can last forever. It was quiet again. That single line didn't sting. It didn't challenge. It just landed. Trump nodded once, his jaw still tight, but his eyes steady. I'll think about that, he said, almost under his breath. The exchange ended not with applause, not with a handshake, but with something deeper. Respect. Reluctant but real. The kind of respect that grows when ego meets experience and finds no easy way out. The audience slowly began to move again. People whispered softly, glancing from one man to the other. Some smiled faintly, others frowned in thought, but everyone felt the same strange energy, as though they had just witnessed something far greater than a debate. In that moment, Obama wasn't just a former president, and Trump wasn't just the current one. They were two symbols of what leadership could mean, one rooted in legacy, the other in lessons. And while Trump had entered the room ready to teach, it was Obama who had ended up giving the lesson. Not with anger, not with dominance, but with history, patience, and quiet certainty. When they finally stood to leave, the applause came, slow at first, then building. It wasn't for one man or the other. It was for the moment itself, the reminder that even in the loudest times, truth doesn't need to shout. Trump walked off the stage, his expression thoughtful. Obama followed, calm and steady, as though the entire exchange had unfolded exactly as he had expected. The hall emptied slowly, but the echoes remained, the kind that don't fade when the lights go out. Because what had just happened wasn't simply an argument or a political clash, it was a reminder that silence, when earned through truth, speaks louder than any voice ever could. As the night wound down and the last of the cameras clicked, something lingered in the air. Not the noise of debate or the weight of rivalry, but a deep, quiet reflection. The crowd was still processing what they had just witnessed. It wasn't a typical exchange of political lines or polished sound bites. It had been something more, a rare, honest confrontation between pride and principle. People began to leave the hall, speaking softly to one another. Some walked quickly, eager to discuss what they'd seen. Others moved slowly, still lost in thought. What made the moment unforgettable wasn't the argument itself, but what it revealed, that two men could stand on the same stage, both powerful in their own way, yet represent entirely different visions of leadership. Trump had come in commanding the room, speaking of legacy, bloodlines, and the kind of power that could be handed down. To him, leadership was continuity, a fortress built by loyalty and name. He had seen the world as a hierarchy, where those who win build empires that last through generations. Obama, on the other hand, had spoken of something intangible, the kind of power that couldn't be inherited or bought. His words reminded everyone that America wasn't built for dynasties but for dreamers, for people who believed that leadership wasn't a family heirloom, but a public responsibility. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. Trump's vision was made of marble and legacy. Obama's was made of memory and service. Yet there was no gloating, no final jab, no dramatic ending. Instead, what lingered was a truth that sat quietly between them, a truth that didn't need to shout to be remembered. As the lights dimmed, Obama's final words seemed to echo in people's minds. Power is temporary, but what we do with it can last forever. Those words would find their way into headlines and conversations for days, but for the people who heard them in that room, they carried something heavier and a question. What kind of leadership truly lasts? The kind that builds a name or the kind that builds a nation? Trump, walking out of the hall, kept his head high, his expression thoughtful. For once there was no smirk, no quick remark. The moment had been humbling even for him. Somewhere in his mind he was replaying every line, not to challenge it, but to understand it. He had always believed leadership was about control, shaping the world through strength and vision. But tonight had reminded him that power can be loud and fleeting, while purpose can be quiet and eternal. Obama, meanwhile, walked with the same calm he had carried all evening. He didn't see the exchange as a victory. To him it was a reminder that history has a way of testing every generation's idea of greatness. The hall was nearly empty now. The last few staff members cleared the stage, packing microphones and folding chairs. The spot where both men had stood felt strangely sacred, not because of fame or status, but because of what had been said there. Two ideas had collided, and for a brief moment, America's reflection had been caught between them. It wasn't just a debate between presidents. It was a conversation about identity, about who America was and what it wanted to be. One believed in preserving the past through inheritance. The other believed in protecting the future through equality. And somewhere in that space between them, the audience had found the heart of the question that would define their time. Who should lead? Those born to power, or those who earn it? Outside the venue, the night air was cool and still. Streetlights flickered over groups of people talking in hushed tones. Some defended Trump's message of strength and tradition. Others repeated Obama's words about service and democracy. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. They had witnessed something real. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't staged. It had been raw, human, and deeply revealing. The image of Trump sitting in silence, listening, would stay with people for a long time. It wasn't weakness they had seen in him. It was something far more human. Reflection. And the image of Obama standing with quiet authority would stay just as strongly. He had reminded the nation of its foundation, not through power but through perspective. In the end, there was no declared winner. But there was a lesson, a powerful one. Leadership isn't measured by how long a name lasts, but by how deeply an idea changes people. The audience had come expecting a clash of egos. What they got instead was a reflection of values, the kind that doesn't end when the cameras stop rolling. As the night gave way to early dawn, a thought settled over everyone who had been there. Legacies fade, fortunes change, but truth, spoken at the right moment, can outlast them all. Obama had spoken like a man reminding the country of its compass. Trump had listened like a man realizing that even the strongest towers can't stand without foundation, and that was the moment's real power. Not in the argument, but in the silence that followed. Because sometimes silence doesn't mean defeat. Sometimes it means understanding. As the world moved on from that night, those who had been there carried something they couldn't quite explain. Not just words, not just history, but a reminder that leadership, at its best, is not about who stands tallest, but who stands for something greater than themselves. And in that quiet realization, the message remained. A country isn't a family business. It's a shared promise, one that must be renewed again and again, by those brave enough to remember what truly makes it great.